It started with a creak in the night. Emily, a single mother, had just moved into an old Victorian house with her 8-year-old daughter, Sophie. The house, though charming, carried an air of abandonment, its walls whispering of forgotten secrets. On the second night, as Emily tucked Sophie into bed, her daughter pointed at the far corner of her room. "Mommy, there's a door there," Sophie said. Emily frowned. The corner was bare, just wallpaper faded with age. "There's no door, sweetheart. It's just the wall." But Sophie insisted. It was there before. A little door. At first, Emily dismissed it as childish imagination. But the next night, as she passed by Sophie's room, she froze. In the faint moonlight, a small door now stood where Sophie had pointed. It was no taller than 4 feet, with chipped white paint and a rusted handle. Her heart raced as she approached. She reached out to touch the handle, but the moment her fingers brushed it, the door vanished, leaving only the wallpaper. The next morning, Emily convinced herself it had been a dream. Stress, exhaustion, moving into a new house always brought its challenges. But Sophie's insistence gnawed at her. "Did you see it, Mommy? The little door?" Sophie asked over breakfast, her eyes wide and excited. Emily hesitated. "I think so, sweetheart. But it's gone now. Maybe you imagined it." Sophie frowned. "I didn't imagine it. It's real." Emily didn't want to argue. "If you see it again, let me know, okay?" That night, as Emily lay in bed, she heard it, the faint creak of a door hinge, soft but unmistakable. Her stomach twisted. Grabbing her phone for light, she hurried down the hall to Sophie's room. She stopped short in the doorway. The small door was back. It stood slightly ajar, revealing only darkness beyond. Sophie sat on her bed, staring at it with wide, unblinking eyes. "Sweetheart, stay back," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. She approached the door cautiously, her hand gripping the phone tightly. "Hello," she called into the darkness. There was no response. But just as she reached for the handle, the door slammed shut with a force that shook the room. Sophie screamed, and Emily grabbed her, pulling her close. The door faded into the wallpaper once more. The following day, Emily called a local historian to learn more about the house. The man, an elderly professor, listened intently as she described the strange occurrences. "You're certain it was a door?" he asked, his voice steady but serious. "Yes," Emily said. "And it keeps disappearing." The professor sighed. "There are stories about houses like yours. Places where things happened. Terrible things. Sometimes the house remembers." "Remembers what?" "People who lived there. Or died there. Doors, windows, staircases. They appear and disappear, like scars from the past. Whatever you do, don't open it again." Emily took his advice to heart, but Sophie grew restless. "The door's trying to show us something," she insisted. "No, Sophie," Emily said firmly. "It's dangerous." But Sophie wouldn't listen. One night, Emily woke to find Sophie's bed empty. Panic gripped her as she raced through the house, calling her daughter's name. When she reached Sophie's room, her worst fear was realized. The door was there again, wide open. "Sophie," Emily screamed, her voice echoing into the void beyond the door. Emily didn't hesitate. Despite every instinct screaming at her to stop, she stepped through the small door, the darkness swallowing her whole. The air inside was cold, heavy, and smelled of damp earth. Her phone's flashlight barely pierced the gloom, illuminating nothing but rough, uneven walls that seemed to stretch endlessly. "Sophie," Emily called, her voice trembling. A faint giggle echoed in the distance. Sophie's giggle. Emily's heart leaped. "Sweetheart, where are you?" The laughter came again, closer this time, but there was something off about it. It was too high-pitched, almost distorted. Emily pressed forward, her footsteps crunching on a gritty floor. Shadows moved at the edges of her vision, but when she turned, there was nothing there. The walls seemed to pulse, as though the house itself were alive. "Sophie, come to Mommy," she pleaded. A voice answered, soft and sweet. "I'm here, Mommy." Emily turned a corner and froze. Sophie was standing at the end of the narrow corridor, her back to her mother. The small, pale figure was motionless, her long hair hanging limply over her shoulders. Sophie. Emily ran to her, dropping to her knees and grabbing her shoulders. The child turned. It wasn't Sophie. The face was wrong. Too smooth, with no nose, no mouth. Only the eyes were there, black and gleaming like polished stones. The thing tilted its head, its hollow gaze locking onto Emily. "You shouldn't have come," it whispered, though it had no mouth to speak. Emily stumbled back, her scream echoing in the suffocating dark. A low, guttural sound rumbled through the walls, and the air grew colder. The shadows that had lingered in the edges of her vision surged forward, surrounding her. The not-Sophie creature pointed behind her, its eyeless stare unrelenting. Emily turned to see the real Sophie, crouched in a corner, clutching her knees to her chest. Tears streamed down the girl's face as she whimpered, "Mommy, I want to go home." Emily bolted toward her, scooping Sophie into her arms. But as she turned back toward the small door, the shadows closed in, blocking their path. "You opened the door," the hollow voice hissed. "Now you must stay." "No," Emily screamed, clutching Sophie tighter. Desperation surged through her as she fumbled for her phone, its flashlight flickering weakly. She remembered the historian's words, "Don't open it again." But she had. "Let us go," Emily shouted. The walls shuddered, the shadows writhing like living things. Then, a new sound joined the chaos, a faint hum, growing louder. It was the voice of the house itself. A crack split the air, and Emily saw the small door reappear ahead, its edges glowing faintly. She ran for it, ignoring the whispers and the icy tendrils clawing at her legs. She reached the door, flung it open, and pushed Sophie through. As she stepped forward, the shadows surged, yanking her back. "Mommy," Sophie screamed, her tiny hands reaching out. Emily shoved Sophie toward safety. "Go. Don't look back." The last thing Emily saw was Sophie's tear-streaked face disappearing as the door slammed shut. When Sophie woke up, she was in her room, the sunlight streaming through the windows. The small door was gone, replaced by the familiar wallpaper. She called for her mother, but there was no answer. Sophie spent hours searching the house, but Emily was nowhere to be found. Years later, when Sophie inherited the house, she found herself drawn to the same spot in her childhood room. One night, the small door reappeared. This time, a voice whispered from the other side, "Don't open it, Sophie." It was her mother. Rachel had always hated moving, but this new apartment felt like a fresh start. After a messy breakup and quitting her job, she was ready to rebuild her life, even if the dingy, underpriced studio wasn't exactly ideal. The building was old, its narrow hallways poorly lit, and the elevator groaned ominously whenever she used it. Still, the apartment itself was cozy enough, and Rachel convinced herself that the creaks and drafts were just part of its charm. A week after moving in, she was unpacking boxes late into the night when she noticed something strange. Her apartment had a door she didn't remember. It was at the end of the short hallway leading to the bathroom, a plain wooden door with a brass knob, slightly ajar. She frowned. What the hell? Rachel had walked down that hallway a dozen times and was certain there hadn't been a door there before. She approached cautiously, nudging it open with her foot. The room on the other side was small and windowless, with pale, peeling wallpaper and an empty wooden chair in the center. Rachel stood frozen, her pulse quickening. She didn't remember a room like this on the floor plan when she signed the lease. Rachel hesitated, her hand gripping the edge of the doorframe. The room was eerily quiet, as if the sounds of the rest of the apartment didn't reach inside. She stepped in cautiously, her footsteps echoing faintly against the wooden floor. The air felt heavier here, colder, and the faint scent of mildew clung to her nostrils. The chair in the center of the room looked old, worn down by time and neglect. She circled it slowly, her skin prickling with unease. As she reached out to touch it, a faint noise stopped her. A whisper. "Rachel." Her breath caught in her throat, and she spun around. The room was empty. The whisper came again, faint and drawn out, like someone speaking from far away. Rachel. She backed toward the door, her heart hammering. The voice grew louder, more distinct, though she couldn't pinpoint its source. Why did you come here? Rachel bolted. She slammed the door shut and ran to her living room, collapsing onto the couch. Her chest heaved as she tried to steady her breathing. The door at the end of the hallway was gone. The next morning, Rachel convinced herself it had been a hallucination. Stress, lack of sleep, it had to be her imagination. But as she brewed coffee, she glanced down the hallway. The door was back. She grabbed her phone and called the building manager, an older man named Mr. Palmer. "Hi, Mr. Palmer. I have a question about the layout of my apartment," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Sure, what's on your mind?" "Was there a small room added recently? At the end of the hallway by the bathroom?" There was a long pause on the other end. "Ma'am," Mr. Palmer said slowly, "there's no room there. Just the bathroom and the closet." Rachel's stomach twisted. "I'm looking at it right now," she said. Another pause. Then, in a quieter voice, Mr. Palmer asked, "Is there a chair inside?" Her blood turned to ice. "Yes." "Why?" "You need to leave," he said urgently. "Get out of the apartment now." "What? Why?" "I don't have time to explain. Just go. I'll meet you outside." The line went dead. Rachel's heart pounded as she stared at the chair. It was impossible. She hadn't moved it, and there was no way it could have gotten into the living room on its own. Her phone buzzed at her hand, making her jump. It was a message from an unknown number. "Do not sit in it." Rachel dropped the phone in shock, her gaze snapping back to the chair. She didn't need the warning. Every fiber of her being told her to stay away from it. Without another thought, she grabbed her purse and bolted for the door. As she flung it open, she nearly ran into Mr. Palmer, who was pale and visibly shaking. "You saw it, didn't you?" he said, his voice low. Rachel nodded, struggling to form words. "The chair it moved. It's in my living room now." Mr. Palmer's face darkened. "It's worse than I thought. You shouldn't have stayed after you saw the room." "What is happening?" Rachel demanded. He looked around nervously, then whispered, "That room doesn't belong to this building. It's something else. Something wrong. And the chair, it's part of it. It latches onto people, follows them," and he trailed off, swallowing hard. "And what?" Rachel pressed. Mr. Palmer's gaze was haunted. "And it takes them." Rachel didn't want to believe him, but every word he said sent chills down her spine. She glanced back into her apartment. The chair hadn't moved, but she could feel its presence, like it was waiting for something. "What do I do?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You need to leave," Mr. Palmer said. "Leave the building, the city, everything. Don't look back. The longer you stay near it, the stronger it gets." Rachel hesitated. She couldn't just abandon her apartment, her things, her life. But before she could respond, the chair moved. It didn't slide or shift, it was just closer. One moment it was in the living room, the next it was right inside the doorway. Rachel screamed, stumbling back into the hallway. "It's already started," Mr. Palmer said grimly. He grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the elevator. As they reached the ground floor, Rachel felt her phone buzz again. She pulled it out and stared at the screen in horror. It was a photo of the chair, now sitting in the elevator behind them. Mr. Palmer and Rachel ran out of the building, not stopping until they reached the parking lot. Rachel's chest burned as she struggled to catch her breath. "We have to destroy it," she said, clutching her phone. "You can't," Mr. Palmer replied. "I've seen others try. It doesn't burn, doesn't break. It always comes back." "Then what do we do?" His expression was bleak. "You run. And you hope it doesn't find you again." Rachel felt a cold sweat break out on her skin. The idea of leaving everything behind felt impossible, but staying meant death. Just as she turned to leave, her phone buzzed one final time. She looked down at the screen. The message was simple. "It's too late." Behind her, she heard the creak of wood. Slowly, she turned. The chair was there, sitting innocently in the middle of the parking lot. And this time, it wasn't empty. The hospital was supposed to be abandoned. Erin had never liked urban exploration, but her friends had convinced her. "Just one night," they'd said. "We'll get some cool photos and leave. It'll be fun." Now, standing outside the crumbling remains of Blackwood Memorial Hospital, Erin wasn't so sure. The building loomed against the night sky, its shattered windows like dark eyes staring down at her. "This place gives me the creeps," she muttered, clutching her flashlight. Her best friend, Maddie, rolled her eyes. "That's the point, Erin. It's supposed to be creepy. Come on, don't chicken out now." Their small group, 4 of them in total, entered through a side door, the rusty hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the air was stale and thick with the smell of mildew. Broken gurneys and shattered medical equipment littered the halls, and graffiti covered the peeling walls. "This is insane," Erin whispered as they wandered deeper into the hospital. "Relax," Maddie said. "It's just an old building." But as they passed an old nurse's station, Erin felt a strange chill. There was a faint noise, like distant footsteps, but when she turned to look, the hallway behind them was empty. The group stopped in front of an old directory sign. Most of the lettering had faded, but one word stood out clearly: basement. "No way," Erin said, shaking her head. "We're not going down there." "That's where the good stuff always is," Maddie replied, already heading for the stairs. Erin hesitated, glancing nervously down the dark corridor. "What's even down there?" Kyle, their self-proclaimed expert on local legends, grinned. "This place used to have a psych ward. Rumor is, the hospital shut down because of what happened down there." "Like what?" Erin asked, regretting the question immediately. "Patients started disappearing," Kyle said, his voice low and dramatic. "Staff, too. Some people said it was the patients rebelling, others said it was something worse. But they never found the bodies." Maddie groaned. "Don't listen to him. It's just a story." "Then why is the psych ward locked behind the basement?" Kyle countered, shining his flashlight at a rusted chain that hung limply across the stairwell door. Erin's stomach twisted. "Guys, I'm serious. Let's just stay upstairs." But Maddie and Kyle had already started down the stairs, their footsteps echoing in the dark. The basement was colder, the air damp and heavy. Erin stayed close to her other friend, Tyler, her flashlight trembling in her hand. "See? Nothing to be afraid of," Maddie said, her voice echoing eerily in the dark. The hallway stretched out ahead, lined with heavy metal doors. Most were ajar, revealing empty rooms with rusted bed frames and broken restraints. But as they moved deeper, the doors began to change. The graffiti disappeared, and the walls seemed cleaner, less decayed. One door stood out, its surface polished and unmarked. "This is it," Kyle said, grinning. "The psych ward." He pushed the door open, and the group stepped inside. The room was pristine. The walls were painted a sterile white, and the floor was spotless. Medical equipment stood neatly arranged, as though the hospital had never been abandoned at all. "What the hell?" Maddie muttered, her voice dropping. Erin's chest tightened. Something about the room felt wrong. Too clean, too quiet. Then she noticed the smell. It was faint at first, but it grew stronger as they moved further in, a sickly, metallic odor that clung to the air. "What is that?" Tyler asked, covering his nose. "It smells like blood," Erin whispered. The metallic scent grew stronger as they ventured deeper into the pristine psych ward. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered, casting long, twitching shadows along the walls. "This isn't right," Erin said, her voice barely above a whisper. "How is this place so clean?" "Probably some restoration project," Kyle said, though even he didn't sound convinced. As they turned a corner, Erin froze. Along the far wall, behind a pane of glass, were rows of faces. At first, she thought they were mannequins, their pale, lifeless expressions staring blankly into the room. But as she stepped closer, her blood ran cold. The faces were real. Dozens of heads floated in murky, yellowing liquid, preserved inside large glass containers. Their eyes were open, clouded and unseeing, their mouths frozen mid-scream. "Oh my God," Maddie breathed, stumbling back. Kyle's flashlight shook as he scanned the rows of faces. "This can't be real," he muttered. Erin's stomach churned, and she gripped Tyler's arm. "We need to leave. Now." Before anyone could respond, a loud clang echoed from behind them. The group spun around, their flashlights cutting through the dark. The door they'd entered through was now sealed, the metal slab firmly in place. "Who closed that?" Maddie asked, panic creeping into her voice. "No one touched it," Tyler said. A soft hum filled the air, growing louder. The fluorescent lights flickered violently, and the faint sound of footsteps echoed through the ward. "We're not alone," Erin whispered. From the far end of the hall, a figure emerged. At first, it moved slowly, dragging its feet as though struggling to walk. Its body was clad in a tattered hospital gown, and its head was tilted at an unnatural angle. Then it stopped, snapping its head upright. Its face was blank, smooth and featureless, like clay that hadn't been molded. Maddie screamed as the figure lurched toward them, its movements jerky and unnatural. "Run," Erin shouted. The group bolted down the hallway, their footsteps echoing like gunshots in the sterile silence. The sound of the creature's uneven pursuit followed them, growing louder with each passing second. Kyle reached the end of the corridor first, throwing himself against a locked door. "It won't open," he shouted, frantically pulling at the handle. The hum intensified, drowning out their panicked breaths. The walls seemed to pulse, as if the hospital itself was alive. Erin glanced back and froze. The creature wasn't alone anymore. More figures were emerging from the shadows, each one faceless and staggering toward them. "We're not going to make it," Tyler gasped. Erin's eyes darted to a panel on the wall, a keypad. Without thinking, she pressed the numbers at random, praying for a miracle. The door clicked. "This way," she screamed, pulling Tyler through. The group tumbled into a small room, slamming the door shut behind them. It was another operating room, but this one was different. A large journal lay open on a blood-stained desk, its pages filled with meticulous handwriting. Erin grabbed it, flipping through the entries. Her hands trembled as she read. Experiment 42. Failed. The subjects cannot retain individuality once transferred. Result: hostile. "What is this?" Maddie asked, her voice shaking. "It's a lab," Erin whispered. "They weren't treating patients. They were experimenting on them, trying to transfer consciousness or something. But it went wrong." Before anyone could respond, a loud bang echoed from the door. The faceless figures were outside, pounding relentlessly. "We're trapped," Kyle said, his voice breaking. Erin's mind raced. Her eyes fell on a red button on the wall labeled Emergency Purge. "What does that do?" Tyler asked. "It's our only chance," Erin said. The pounding grew louder, the door buckling under the force. Erin hesitated for only a moment before slamming her hand onto the button. Alarms blared, and the room was bathed in red light. Through a small window, Erin watched as thick gas began to flood the hallway, engulfing the faceless creatures. Their movements grew frantic, limbs flailing as the gas consumed them. One by one, they collapsed, their bodies dissolving into black sludge. The banging stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a mechanical voice crackled over the intercom. "Purge complete. Containment restored." The group stumbled out of the hospital as dawn broke, their clothes damp with sweat and their faces pale. None of them spoke as they climbed into the car and drove away, leaving Blackwood Memorial behind. Erin clutched the journal tightly, her mind racing with unanswered questions. The hospital might have been abandoned, but something still lived there, something that wasn't meant to exist. She only hoped they'd closed the door for good.